Thank you very much for your very kind introduction, Mr. Fatala. And actually, he speaks Uyghur like a Uyghur accent. A lot of Mongols who come from East Turkestan, they all speak just the accent Uyghur, very impressive. And some of them are in the US, so whenever we meet, we speak in a beautiful Uyghur language. And today I would like to talk about really briefly, of course, on the history and the current situation in East Turkestan. And most people in China, when they heard about East Turkestan, of course, they associate with mostly the Chinese government's claim that East Turkestan terrorist forces, 东突恐怖实力. So automatically they think East Turkestan has something to do with terrorism, which is absolutely not true. That's one thing. Another is most of the people in China, they learn about the history of East Turkestan, or as the Chinese government or people call Xinjiang, which of course Xin means new, Jiang means land, new territory, from the Chinese government. When I say Chinese government, is of course China's current communist government. After 1949, after the Chinese government's occupation of East Turkestan and other neighboring territories, the Chinese government obviously, for political reasons, distorted and changed the history of the Uyghurs, Tibetans, Mongols, and other so-called minorities. So the history that has been in Chinese textbooks, history books, in Chinese government official narratives that you have heard from kindergarten to all your life really is a distorted history by the Chinese government in order to justify the occupation, annexation, and the ongoing colonization of these territories. Of course, the first thing you hear about Xinjiang is Xinjiang has been an inalienable part of China since ancient times. That has been repeated all the time in the Chinese media, from the mouths of Chinese government officials and China's current historical narratives and records. And the reason why they say Xinjiang is an inalienable or inseparable part of China since ancient times, or the same thing applies to Tibet and Inner Mongolia, is precisely because these territories have not been inseparable part of China since ancient times. Because the Chinese government never say Shandong has been an inseparable part of China since ancient times, because there is no question it is part of China since ancient times. And with us and others, of course, that's not true. So the Chinese government is compelled and even forced to justify that these territories have in fact been part of China, which we know obviously not true. So the history that I'm going to touch upon is not so much that you are aware of or you have heard of, especially from the Chinese government sources. It's very different. It's from the Uyghur people's perspective, the history that I'm going to discuss. So I prepared a little PowerPoint presentation. Hopefully that will give you a better background on East Turkestan. Of course, this is the geography that the Chinese government doesn't like to see, and most nationalistic Chinese don't want to see, I would say. And East Turkestan, as you see, it's northwestern part of today's China. It lies in Central Asia. Below us is Tibet. Of course, on the map, you see Tibet is much bigger than the Tibetan Autonomous Region. And this is actually the territory Tibet claims to be real Tibet. Oh, sorry, it became automatic, I think. And southern Mongolia is southern Mongolia, and the rest of the territories, which is within the Great Wall of China, is really China. And East Turkestan, has always been the motherland of the Uyghurs, of course, as well as Kazakh, Kyrgyz, Uzbek, other peoples. I think it's still automatic now. And others. And other 13 groups. So we have Mongols and others who joined us throughout history. But the Chinese population are really a new phenomenon. They came after the Manchu-Qing occupation of East Turkestan. And the size of East Turkestan, as you can see, it's sort of as big as Alaska. It's 1/6 of today's PRC. Next. And East Turkestan was first occupied by the Manchu-Qing dynasty in 1884. They tried to occupy it earlier, of course. Then the Manchu-Qing dynasty, after occupation of East Turkestan, they changed the name into Xinjiang, because prior to that, the Manchus didn't have a name for that. Many Chinese historians say they called Xiyu. That was the ancient name given by the Chinese to this territory. But Xiyu, or Western regions, really meant the territories beyond the western side of the Great Wall. All the territories on the western territories, including today's Iran, Iraq, Afghanistan, all included as western regions. It's not just today's East Turkestan. And in the 19th century, there was great game in Central Asia that took place. During the Great Game period, the British occupied India, the Tsarist Russians were expanding into Central Asia, and the British were very afraid that the Russians will come down from Afghanistan and East Turkestan and kick the British out of the Indian continent. So the British Empire actually supported the Manchu-Qing dynasty, funded and even armed the Manchu-Qing dynasty. As a result, Zhou Zongtang, he led the Manchu-Qing army and came occupied East Turkestan. And then the territory was renamed to Xinjiang. Then in 1911, of course, the Manchu-Qing dynasty collapsed and the Republic of China was announced by Sun Yat-sen. And the mainland China basically became a republic. Then with us and other territories were in a semi-independent situation. Uyghurs and others revolted against later Chinese warlord rules, and Uyghurs declared independence twice. One is in 1933, second time in 1944. In 1933, the Soviet Union supported the Chinese, actually Manchu warlord Shen Shishai in crushing Uyghur independence in 1933. In 1944, however, the Soviet Union supported the independence of East Turkestan because the Soviets were against Chinese nationalists, which were supported by the US at the time, of course. Then, at the same time, the Soviets were supporting the Chinese communists, supporting Mao Zedong. Actually, Mao Zedong obviously worked for the Soviet communists. But in 1949, when the Uyghur Republic were formally established, had the total control of East Turkestan territory, what Stalin did was, in 1949, of course, it was sort of the beginning of the Cold War, starting 1945 and on. So Stalin thought he needed Mao Zedong and Mao Zedong's support of Soviet Union in his struggle against the West, because it was a Cold War. So Stalin thought the best way to get Mao's support is to betray the independence of East Turkestan and allow East Turkestan to be forcibly annexed by the Communist Chinese forces, then to create Sino-Soviet alliance against the West. So, Soviet Union, these are actually the two presidents of East Turkestan. The first one is Alihan Ture, the second one is Ahmadjan Qasimi. And Stalin invited Ahmadjan Qasimi and his cabinet, entire cabinet, to come to Soviet territory of Kazakhstan to negotiate for final settlement of East Turkestan in relation to the new founding Republic of People's Republic of China. These are the East Turkestan military forces. You can see these were not just the guerrilla fighters. We had 40,000 standing armies. You see the mounted armed forces, artillery forces, standing forces, and forces. These are all East Turkestan standing army forces. And these are, you see the second picture is, you see the Uyghur females officials, officers on the left, Uyghur male officers on the right side. They are East Turkestan Republic Army. And during the 40s, you see the Uyghur women on the left, the Uyghur students on the right. These are not like, so when the Chinese government calls Uyghurs are backward, barbarian, Uyghurs take that as insult because we're not barbarians, we are not uneducated or uncivilized people. These are 1940 pictures, right before Chinese communist occupation of East Turkestan. Then, right before the declaration of the funding of the People's Republic of China by Mao Zedong, Stalin invited Uyghur leaders to Soviet Union. Then when Uyghur leaders rejected the idea that East Turkestan should be incorporated into People's Republic of China, according to Soviet records, East Turkestan leadership all were executed by Stalin, upon Stalin's orders. Then Stalin and Mao concocted the theory that the plane that was carrying them to Beijing exploded, killed all the president and the ministers of East Turkestan Republic. Then Stalin and Mao invited Saifuddin Azizi. It's the guy who is smiling to Mao in the picture, who was a pro-Soviet Uyghur puppet. He basically allied with Stalin. He was sent to be part of the declaration of the People's Republic of China. Then he became the first governor of Xinjiang, Saifuddin Aziz. So he's a chairman of the Xinjiang region at the time. Then you can see on the last picture was the Uyghur leadership killed, but there was it was announced that they died on a plane crash. Their bodies brought back and buried, but their bodies were not allowed to see even by their own wives. And in 1949, Soviet Union supported the Chinese Communist forces to come and occupy East Turkestan. And the Chinese general is Wang Zhen. And he led PLA forces. His forces, the Soviet Union provided airplane to carry the Chinese soldiers at the border of Xinjiang, and also provided military weapons, including tanks, artilleries, and heavy weaponry. And he led Chinese PLA forces and came occupy East Turkestan. But Uyghurs resisted against Chinese occupation, but Wang Zhen committed not genocide, but nearly genocide, mass massacre of the Uyghur people who resist against Chinese occupation. But in the early days of Chinese occupation, strangely, the Chinese Communist government claimed that they came to cleanse the crimes of the Chinese nationalists and the Qing occupation. They came to help liberate the Uyghur people, and they were going to leave after 5 years of building the nation up, leave the East Turkestan and let the Uyghur people decide their political destiny. 5 years later, they created what is now the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region. Then, of course, they created the same thing in Tibet, in Inner Mongolia, and other areas. A purported fake autonomy given to the Uyghurs and other groups, which has no real substance. And since then, they used yeah, thank you very much, because I don't have a lot to talk. And thank you, I appreciate that. And since 1955 thereon, although by name it is Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, but all political, military, economic powers are controlled by the Chinese. The party secretary is always a Chinese person. It's the same in Tibet and other areas. And he wields all political power. He decides all the decisions and policies.